We're going to move on now to what is referred to as conflict theory, and it can be found on page 41 of your textbook. And so this is what Mann juxtaposes with functionalism. So it's a very different view of society where Parsons is emphasizing social cohesion and integration. This is a theory that looks at the need for change. And so it can be revolutionary theory, such as Marxism, or it can be like Weber's critique of society, but this is something that recognizes that, which criticizes or undermines the status quo as part of its theoretical architecture. On page 41, Mann sets out the basic assumptions of conflict theory, and he starts out with the idea that it emphasizes conflict over consensus in order to understand society. So it's more of a hermeneutic of suspicion. These theorists are looking at society much more critically rather than looking in terms of conformity and deviance. They're critiquing their society, and so the emphasis is on where there is conflict and disagreement within society. It also postulates that competition and conflict are natural or at least ubiquitous. And so this is from within the point of view of conflict theory. It's the idea that anybody who doesn't see this is naive. And again, it may be because they are at the top of the sort of hierarchy of the society, and so they don't see any need for change. And so this is highly political, obviously. People who adhere to conflict theory tend to be, generally speaking, on the left wing of the political spectrum. And so they're calling for change. They're calling for a more equal society often. There's often a utopian strain within this approach. The idea that hierarchy is ubiquitous, so there's often a critique of the way that society is the status systems within society, the class systems within society, and the way in which political and economic power are distributed throughout the system. So this is very different than, for instance, a view which we will be looking at that just says, the strongest survive, that kind of social Darwinism. This is saying that it's much more complex than that, that this system is gamed, it's rigged to benefit certain people. Ideas and values are used for individuals and groups to attain their ends. So again, this is a very sophisticated kind of approach to the idea of ideas and values or norms that certainly when we look at Marx is going to say that a lot of these cultural norms are just a way to keep people from rising up against their oppressors. And so many conflict theorists would say that most of the cultural norms are what are given by the elites of society, and so they are obviously going to benefit those people, whether it's consciously or unconsciously. I want to turn now to a very important American sociologist named C. Wright Mills, and he has a number of works that are considered canonical within sociology. And I've chosen this picture on purpose because you can see immediately the difference between him and a lot of the other sociologists we've been looking at. There's definitely a rebellious streak within C. Wright Mills. He was, if not part of it, certainly interested in the movement of the new left that was emerging in the United States at the time. And so the way Mann puts it in your textbook, C. Wright Mills was an unruly Texan who in the 1950s drew his theoretical six-gun and took deadly aim at the conservative worldview he saw all around him in American intellectual life. So Mills really saw himself as a critic of his society, sort of criticizing it from within. So Mann goes on to say, he fired off 4 rounds that disrupted the calm complacency of functionalist social theory, white collar, the power elite, and the cause of World War III, and the sociological imagination. So these are his main works. I'm going to be looking at some of them a little later. So Mills, as I said, very different type of academic to the ones we've been looking at. And in some ways, he's a precursor, or in many ways, a precursor of the 1960s. He died very young. He died in his 40s, so he didn't get to see the 1960s, but he would have fit right in. And in some ways, he contributed to the cultural changes that were coming about because he was widely read and his criticisms were taken on board by a lot of people in progressive circles. He's a type of academic you don't often see anymore. There were a few of them around when I was an undergrad. One of them was fired, and on the front page of the Washington Post, that's a whole other story, but sort of larger than life figure, this married multiple times, so very colorful figure, and very critical of his society. Mills was born into a middle-class family in Waco, Texas in 1916 and died in 1962. As I said, he died very young from a heart condition. And he taught at Columbia for his entire career. And he emphasized the need for academics to be engaged rather than taking a stance of disinterested observation. And I have touched on this. This is still sometimes debated within academia, what the role of the academic or the intellectual is. Is it to sit and write and observe kind of quote unquote objectively, or is it for them to attempt to change society, to be critical of society? Now, obviously, Mills fit into the latter camp. So he was very influenced by Marx and Weber. So both of these often included in conflict theory, certainly Marx is. And so was taking a lot of their critiques on board, but trying to apply it to the American society that he was living in. And he saw that as his role as, we would call it, a public intellectual, so somebody who also wrote for the mainstream press and was trying to influence society and make it better. So he was critical of capitalism, bureaucracy, and the inequalities in society. And so we see in his work, Mills is looking out over American society post-World War II and not liking what he's seeing. Certainly in some of his works, there's a very nostalgic tone, which is rather like Weber. So looking back to the early days of America when people were more individualistic and had control of their lives and so on. And so we're going to be looking at that as we move through this lecture. One of Wright's most important and influential works is The Sociological Imagination, published in 1959. And he develops this idea of understanding the world through the lens of sociology. And he says that this denotes a worldview that connects private biographical experience of individuals to historical patterns and larger society. So this is the larger idea that I've been talking about. So I'll give an example. So we see, for instance, in our society right now, rising rates of depression and anxiety. So this is generally, in my understanding, seen as kind of a personal issue. You're not handling stress well. Maybe it's biological. It's often dealt with through a medical lens. But from this point of view, if we look at huge numbers of people in a society suffering from from anxiety, from a sociological perspective, we might start asking questions like, why is this the case? What about society is creating this? So it's a very different way of looking at things rather than just as a personal issue, is seeing it within the larger pattern of society. Or, for instance, the opioid epidemic. What are the larger forces that are creating that? We can't just say it's personal failure when it's at this level numerically. So this combines a micro and macro perspective, as we talked about at the beginning of the course. So it's connecting the two together, and it offers a framework for understanding our experiences within the larger social world. So the aim is to give understanding, and then certainly from Mills's point of view, to change it and to take back power. So as Mann states on page 46, he starts the sociological imagination by noting how much modern people feel unable to control their lives. They feel trapped in their private orbits by forces beyond their control. Now, this is an interesting point. I don't know if this is true. I think it might be that people don't realize they're trapped in a private orbit. I think we've become so individualized, we don't necessarily even think about it. I would be interested to know your thoughts on this in the discussion boards about that, what you think about that. People in the mid-20th century have witnessed great changes. Industrialization and capitalism have transformed huge parts of the world from a feudal to a modern state, changing our lives in a profound way. Yet all of this has eaten away at our most cherished values. So this is very Weberian, this idea that bureaucracy, rationalization, the Industrial Revolution has come into our personal lives, often through bureaucracy and through work, and changed us. And so makes it much more difficult to live a fully human life. And again, I ask you to think about that if you think that's true or not. So he goes on to say, Mills argues that the best sociology allows us to grasp the relations between the history of a society and the biographies of the actors within it, as mediated by social structure. So this is very different than Talcott Parsons, obviously, who's just accepting that system. Instead, Mills is seeing it within a historical evolution and how it's impacting us. Mann calls Mills's book, The Power Elite, published in 1956, his most famous and most polemical book. And he says it's a kind of conspiracy theory. I think that's too harsh. In this work, Mills critiques American society, which he believed was run by a powerful elite, invisible to most people. And as Mann says on page 49, Mill's basic argument in The Power Elite is quite simple. The economic and military and political elites in America in his day formed an interlocking structure that made many of the key decisions, determining the fate of both the average person and the country. I don't think this is a conspiracy theory. I think this is just an analysis of what he saw. I think one way of getting at this, it's always interesting to do it either, say, in Canadian Parliament or American Senate. What class did they come from? What schools did they go to? This is perhaps more clear in the American case because of, as I said, that private university system, how many of them went to Harvard, how many of them went to the Ivy Leagues, etc. It's pretty clear that most politicians are drawn from certain classes of society. In some ways, this has only become more so, and it may have changed slightly because we see in the current time period that kind of the technocrats, so the Silicon Valley people, have gained huge amount of power, and we just witnessed this. Well, he kind of crashed and burned, but with Elon Musk, that idea of this small group of people kind of taking extreme amounts of power within the political world. Again, I don't think this is as true within Canada, but without a doubt, I think if we went through the background of most people in politics, we would find that they're upper middle class. Not always, obviously. So from Mills's point of view, these groups, they often know each other, they often help each other, and so there's a Marxian angle to this, and so that they control the wealth and the power of their society. I want to look now at White Collar, the American Middle Classes, that was published in 1951. This is considered a standard text within sociology and has been reprinted many, many times. And it argues that styles of middle-class American life represent modern society as a whole and a growing sense of alienation. And so in your textbook, he says rationalization and alienation in the workplace. So in this work, Mills is sort of overlooking society in the 1950s and early 1960s and seeing the changes that have come about through bureaucracy. And so, as Mann writes on page 47 of your textbook, Mills agrees with Weber that Western society is firmly in the grips of the iron cage of bureaucratic rationality, of the calculating hierarchies of department store and industrial corporation, and rationalized office and government bureau. So when I started working on this lecture, I was trying to look up some statistics in the Canadian case of how many people work in these kind of jobs, because there's often the idea that everybody works in service industry now. But in fact, from what I can gather, A lowball estimate is that 21% of Canadians work for the government. And so that is absolutely a white collar job and would fit within this schemata. So that's just the government. So there are many other, obviously, white collar jobs in Canada. So includes an examination of office employees, sales personnel, lower managers, and how they emerge from the spread of bureaucracy and corporate expansion. And so Mills is looking at this with horror, actually, and the way that these rationalized bureaucracies impact people. And he has particular words to say for the whole rise of the salesperson. I find this very interesting because I was never a fan, but when, Mad Men was a huge phenomenon and there was a lot of nostalgia around that, and I found it really interesting because Mills is so critical of these kind of jobs that advertising, he would have seen it as a kind of parasitic industry that was just fueling capitalism and causing people to desire things they don't need, for instance. But certainly we've seen a kind of nostalgia actually for this time period, and I'd be interested to know what you think about that. An indictment of institutional conformity and status seeking. So again, as I said, there is a kind of a nostalgia within his thought for the good old days when, he talks about American frontiersmen. Now, obviously, we could critique this. So there's no conception at this time period of that this land was taken from Indigenous people, and sort of the mythology of the frontier is highly problematic. But he is definitely harking back to when people had more control over their lives. So in the introduction to the book, Mills writes, the white-collar people slip quietly into modern society. Whatever history they have had is a history without events. Whatever common interests they have do not lead to unity. Whatever future they have will not be their own making. It is to this white-collar world that one must look for much that is characteristic of 20th century existence. Now, this is polemic. This is his opinion. I don't know if this is true. Again, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this. This idea that any person, regardless of their job, has no history and has no agency, I think is problematic. But he's making a point here about the ways in which this type of work dehumanizes people. And I think that's a very important point. And he also argues that it depoliticizes them. I'm going to talk a bit more about this later. I don't know if that's completely true either, but that's how he's seeing it. By examining white-collar life, it is possible to learn something about what is becoming typically American than the frontier character ever was. What must be grasped is the picture of society as a great sales room, an enormous file in an incorporated brain, a new universe of management and manipulation. And so this puts me in mind of The Good Place, where heaven or hell is just a giant bureaucracy with all these files. So certainly from his point of view, it is a kind of hell. And so it's the sales room, it's the filing cabinet. And it is interesting to look at this idea of management and manipulation when we think of the way people are educated within business schools. This is certainly part of the training in management, and I'm always highly I have dark wonderings about what they're being taught. If any of you are in business, please fill us all in. But certainly that idea of human resources and management is part of that larger bureaucracy that's sort of come into the lives of many, many people. Mills's concerns were also being reflected in art and culture at the time, and so we see the book by Sloan Wilson, The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, published in 1955, right in the middle of the 50s. And so the plot of the book is a middle-class couple who are having money problems. The main character is a Harvard graduate who works in Manhattan. And so he had served in the army, so he's a kind of every American man. So he was a GI. He has what we would call PTSD, remembering experiences during the war. He's now working this kind of corporate job and under an incredible amount of pressure. And so the book and the film are looking at these issues playing out within the middle classes in America and also within Canada at that time. And so if we look at this photograph, this, I think, encapsulates the concern that these people all look identical. They're wearing the exact same hats, the exact same suits. This idea of conformity and having no individuality, this fear of being kind of lost within mass society, is being expressed both in the book and in the film. In the section of the book called The Bureaucratic Context, we can see that Mills is building on Weber's idea of the iron cage and bureaucratic rationality. So he is arguing that this is also influencing academics and intellectuals. So he writes, bureaucracy increasingly sets the conditions of intellectual life. For the intellectual who would remain free yet still seek a public, this general trend is sharpened. I've got a little grammatical error here. Just ignore that. The difficulty of speaking one's mind in dissent has increased. So we have to remember that this is America during the Cold War and in the grips of the Red Scare. So we have things like, we have events like McCarthy and artists and writers and academics being put on trial in the House of Un-American Activities. This didn't happen as much in Canada. It did happen, but not to the same extent. So people were being fired. They were losing their livelihoods. So he's very aware of this and that he's working within this very threatening context that's working against free speech. But also, even if we look at our own time, I think, if anything, this is more the case. And again, it depends on the place, but many... You've probably heard the idea of publish or perish. So in many universities, it's almost a factory model. The academic has to produce X number of articles a year, or their job is in jeopardy. I've been very fortunate in my career. Probably working at Nipissing has made a huge difference there, of a smaller place. I have not felt that same kind of pressure. But certainly I know people that have, and it's very inimical to a creative, thoughtful life to have that rush and pressure. And so it's really a kind of applying of the factory model to intellectual life, which is the opposite of what it would have been originally. So Mills is critiquing how these forces are impacting and shaping all aspects of life. In this section, Mills gets right straight to it, which he calls the morale of the cheerful robot. So you can see comparing workers to robots. And in your textbook on page 47, he says, white-collar workers are tools in a bureaucratic machine that routinizes and specializes their labor into narrow niches. As a result, they become apathetic, frightened, and estranged from their jobs. They help to create profits for others during their dull daily routine, yet get little intellectual stimulation from their work. The loss of traditional values and self-esteem embroils bureaucrats and other office workers in what he calls a status panic. So here we have the idea of the human being is in the machine and is becoming like a machine. So he writes, the alienation of the individual from the product and process of his work came about in the first instance as a result of the drift of modern capitalism. So this is very basic Marx, the idea of alienation from one's labor. Then Frederick Taylor and other scientific managers raised the division of labor to the level of planful management. So Taylorism being that kind of factory model, and I don't know if any of you have worked in factories, but if you have, you will know very well incredibly horrible it is to just do this one task over and over again, and you never see the finished product of your work. There's no satisfaction in the work. And we know that this can be for most people, causes a lot of psychological distress. And certainly you don't have satisfaction in your work. So by centralizing plans as well as introducing further divisions of skill, they further routinized work in factory and office. Management effort to create job enthusiasm reflects the unhappy unwillingness of employees to work spontaneously at the routinized tasks. So here he's speaking to what we would now call human resources. So that idea, some of you may have experienced it or certainly witnessed it, that idea of how companies try to motivate their workers, have weekends away where they try to motivate them to sell more. They get their T-shirts and their events together and so on. So it's a creating, sort of ostensibly trying to create community, but there's this very artificial feeling to it. And the idea that the worker just becomes a machine, and so there's no interest in that they have enough leisure time, that in their health, and so on. And so that was certainly part of the plot of The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, that at the end of the book, he rejects the job that has too much pressure, and he chooses one that allows him to have a personal life. In his conclusion, Mills seems to be quite pessimistic, and as I said, he didn't get to see the 60s. I think that probably would have made him feel a little bit better. But he writes, in an impersonalized and more anonymous system of control. So he's basically saying, within feudalism, you knew who the lord of the manor was. You knew who was oppressing you. But within a bureaucracy, it's very unclear who's in power and who's the one doing it. It's just a system, it's a structure. So explicit responses are not so possible. Anxiety is likely to replace fear. So linking back to what I was saying earlier, that idea that perhaps these states of anxiety are linked to the way that we're working and living. Insecurity to replace worry. So I think that's important. It's not to say, a peasant in the feudal period was like a happy-go-lucky soul, but it was worry rather than insecurity. It was fear rather than anxiety. I don't know if that's better, but it's different. The problem is who really has power, for often the tangled and hidden system seems a complex yet organized irresponsibility. So they talk about that in Eichmann in Jerusalem. Hannah Arendt talks about the banality of evil, that people within a bureaucracy can always say, I'm not responsible for what happened, I was just following orders. Targets for revolt, given the will to revolt, are not readily available. In fact, there are no explicit symbols of authority to challenge. So he's basically saying, how did these workers even revolt against what's happening? Because you don't know who's in control. You don't know who to go up against. Now, I think he's overstating here. So this also relates to unionization, and Mills was very interested in that. And certainly within Canada, we have retained, on an international scale, quite high rates of unionization. So this would look different, and I certainly know of office workers who've gone on strike right here at Nipissing and in Canada. So that's not really true. But perhaps the United States, where particularly after the 80s, the unionization rate has gone down to, I think it's 12% compared to 30%, around 30% in Canada, that this may in fact still be very true. But again, as I said, by the time the 60s hit, we see full-on revolt and people really questioning this style of life. And I think we're seeing it in different forms in our time period. I watch a lot of the YouTubers who are questioning that life of 9 to 5 and or even more than that, of having multiple jobs. So the idea of quality of life, and even though they're often criticized for it, that idea of wanting experiences rather than material possessions and so on. And so we're seeing all sorts of movements in our time period that are questioning exactly what he's getting at. And I think it's interesting to see this in light of this mandate to go back into the office that many people are resisting, not very successfully, but that working at home, people are able to live a more human life and to combine it with other aspects of life. And so this is an ongoing issue in our society. I wanted to end here by looking at some cultural reactions to these same issues and questions, sort of a modern day Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, and two very different kind of responses. So I wanted to look at The Office, the very famous sitcom that ran from 2005 to 2013. I'm sure many of you have watched it or are familiar with it. So it's set at Dunder Mifflin, a paper company in Scranton. And so at the belly of the white-collar beast here, sort of in what seems to be a dying industry. And so it's based, you probably know, on the British show, which was much more cynical. It's interesting to watch the first season because it's much closer to the British version, the North American public didn't like it, so they had to change it. They had to make Michael Scott more likable and so on. But what emerges is actually something I think even better, which is looking at the forces of bureaucratization, but also the way in which people fight back against it. And so I think it's actually very effective in looking at the good and the bad. And there's certain characters that kind of encapsulate different attitudes. Some of them have just given up and they're just waiting for retirement. Some of them are actively looking for more meaningful work. But within that office, there are all sorts of relationships that have formed between people as well. And so I'm going to ask you in the discussion boards what you think of this and what has been your own work experience. It's very hard, if not impossible, to remove the humanity from the workplace. It always creeps back in. And so I think the office does a really great job of looking at the way, even within these bureaucracies, humanity reasserts itself. A much darker take on the office environment can be seen in the hit series Severance, that's still running. I think it's still running. And its approach to work. And I think even just the design of the show, if you've seen it, the white offices, there's no plans, there's no art. It's very exaggerated, but not unrecognizable. The fluorescent lights, the lack of windows. This is often how our institutional spaces look, including in universities. And so this whole series, from what I have been able to glean, was based on Erickson's, the writer's experience when he was trying to break into show business and was working for, I think it was a door company. And so he was on the computer day after day looking at hinges. And so you can see how that kind of work would lead to this show. And so in an interview, he says, people who work in a corporate environment or in an environment where they're part of a greater whole, they are often encouraged to diminish their humanity. Leave your baggage at the door, come in and only bring the parts of yourself that are going to be valuable here, Erickson explained. And we take that to heart, he said. So this is very similar to what Mills was saying in the 1950s and early 60s, that our jobs shape us. We spend many hours a day at our jobs. And so if that structure is dehumanizing us, that is going to have an impact. And so he takes it to the kind of the utmost extreme where you get an operation and you don't remember, your brain is severed into two pieces. So he continued, those of us who can't feel like we're being productive, we end up feeling we're useless. I think that's heartbreaking because it is tempting to diminish ourselves because it's hard to accept all parts of ourselves. So this idea of not being able to be a complete, fully human being within the work environment. So this is his critique, and I already touched on the way that Amazon has gotten into trouble for the incredibly dehumanizing practices with its workers. And again, you could look at this within a larger critique of capitalism, and we will be doing that next. But I'd be interested again to hear your thoughts on the show if you've seen it, and on The Office. Is it in fact impossible to be fully human in most of the forms of work that we have today, or does that humanity always shine through? I'll be interested to know your thoughts.